Hi students, it's Dr. Winkler again, bringing to you your favorite lecture on Greek civilization. This is for the Ancient Civilization course, and this is lecture number 15. So we're moving right along. We've been discussing Greek philosophy. Remember, I made an argument that among the most important contributions we get, in other words, the modern world gets from the ancient Greeks, is in fact philosophy. And so many of our philosophical constructs actually start out with very early arguments, including those made by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So I was trying to give you an understanding of the kind of contributions that we see coming from these early thinkers. Remember this, as far as we know, Socrates did not write anything, at least anything that has survived. So what we know about him was written by other people. I mentioned Xenophon earlier on, that he also wrote about some of the dialogues of Socrates. One of the interesting things about Xenophon was that he actually presented Socrates as somebody who could be beat in an argument. Plato doesn't really approach him that way. Plato approaches him in such a manner that it's almost like Socrates is infallible. He can never be outdone, shall we say, in a statement or in one of these dialogues. Remember the early dialogues? Let's get you up here, right here. The early dialogues, we believe, though this was written by Plato, that essentially the information presented in the early dialogues are Socrates' ideas. The middle dialogues, as I mentioned to you last time, are the dialogues where we think that some of the ideas of Socrates are represented. However, we've seen a pretty good infusion of Plato in there as well. The laws, totally Plato in this case. I should say the late dialogues and the example, most important example, late dialogues, are the laws. Okay. What are these like? In the early dialogues, Socrates is the humble seeker of truth. They really don't have a resolution. Remember, I mentioned this to you last time. The reason why you don't have a resolution is actually you are the person. It's your intellect. It's going to come up with a conclusion here. But can we say the dialogue set the parameter, and it gives you the kinds of things you should be thinking about as you come up with your own ideas. Remember, Euthyphro, Socrates is waiting in the docket. He's going to be accused of introducing new gods, impiety, if you will, and corrupting the youth. And he has this conversation with Euthyphro about what is right and wrong. And actually, there's no conclusion here, but can we say in this discussion, a lot of the parameters that you might want to consider in that kind of discussion are laid out. The apology, which I also mentioned to you last time, was actually Socrates' appeal to the court. Remember this 500-man court, the boule? And this is his defense of a life of the intellect. And he's found guilty, and he is given a sentence of death. We do believe that the people who passed sentence on him to have him executed really didn't want to kill him. Let's just get rid of this guy. What a pain in the neck. Always shooting his mouth off, and these kids are following him, and they're disrespectful to us older folks. Just get him out of town. Okay, this is where we were at last time. We're now to the Crito. Remember, Socrates tend to appeal to young men, to young people. They liked his new ideas. They liked his approach. They liked him challenging the kinds of things they've been taught for a lengthy period of time. So Crito's one of these people. And this is essentially taking place after the condemnation. From the apology, after the condemnation is placed upon him, and he's sentenced to death. Once again, everybody thinks he's going to run, but he doesn't. He tries to explain himself to Crito. In this he says, I'm an old man. Can we go back and look at his dates? I'm an old man. I've been an Athenian for a very lengthy period of time. I've been an Athenian my entire life. As a young man, you can see he's, 70 years of age, roughly, maybe a little older than that. By our standards, that's not terribly old. By their standards, that's an old man. You probably don't have many teeth left if you're that old. And, the crick in the back and all these kinds of things become a real problem. You'd probably be declining in physical vigor. You're an old man. But he says, all this life, all my life, I have lived in Athens. All my life. I have benefited from the laws of Athens. In fact, as a young man, I was in the military. I had armor. I went out and defending this. So I benefited from this my entire life. And just because at one point it doesn't really go my way, I'm going to throw away my entire life, throw away all the benefits I've got? Isn't it much better for me to take the judgment of the court, my peers, if you will, and assume that is acceptable? I guess the crux of this you can lay down to essentially a simple argument here. It is never right to do wrong. Okay, we can find excuses for it, can we not? Oh, well, it's circumstantial. Can we say more or less he's talking about that which is not circumstantial ethics, but an ethic that you just simply can't argue against? You don't change the parameters because it doesn't go in your direction. You stay with the idea. Well, now we're going to the middle dialogues. The Phaedo, if we're talking about a sequence, and actually they make a pretty good chronology, Oithyphro, the Apology, then Crito. The next one, which we often consider to be a middle dialogue, is dealing with the death, the execution, if you will, of Socrates. This is the account of his death. Plato even said he wasn't there. Plato said he couldn't, well, it's like Socrates doing the talking. But as they mention, who's present, young men, they said that Plato did not come. He could not watch the death of his mentor and his dear friend. So whatever information we get on the death of Socrates, Plato didn't get it first person. Somebody else told him about it. Well, the Phaedo actually starts out like the day, or shall I say the night before he's going to be executed. Now, fortunately, that's never happened to me. But I can imagine, at least I think I can, that if I was going to be executed tomorrow, I wouldn't sleep well the night before. This would be a night of great insomnia. I might seek comfort in people that talk to me, friendships, becoming connected with other people who care about you. I think that would be quite comforting. And that's what Socrates does. Would you speculate what's going to happen next? Where I am right now will not exist in a matter of a day or a matter of hours. Is there an afterlife? Socrates says he cannot prove this logically. He can't set up with a logical premise and make a number of arguments. But he does believe he has a soul that will survive after death. Some of what he says is actually more or less in the realm of speculation. Since he doesn't know what the next life is like, he says it could be very nice. All the thinkers, all the philosophers that have gone on before, now I'll be with them again. Could you imagine the conversations, the discussions, the knowledge we're going to achieve by that process? That doesn't sound so bad. He speculates a little bit. He said, well, I think hardworking people might have another life. They might come back as ants. Now, I wouldn't call that a step up, but hardworking people, ants, at least have that in common. He says, how about mean and vicious people? Bullies. They're going to come back as wolves. All right. So he's speculating more than he knows, obviously. But his insights are really quite fascinating. The dialogue does continue to the point of execution. They did not have the numerous poisons that are available from modern chemistry. The poison they really have is hemlock. And hemlock is not one of your fast-acting kind of poisons. Essentially what it does is this. You take the hemlock, it goes into your body, and starting with your feet and working up through your body, it essentially loosens, or shall I say, relaxes your muscles. That doesn't sound too bad until it gets to your heart. See, what's going to happen is this. He's going to take the hemlock, and it will start to relax the muscles in his feet, which means he will lose control of his feet. And then it will slowly move up through his body and move up through the lower extremities, finally get into his trunk. And when it gets to his heart and relaxes the muscle in the heart, he will die. You can imagine this is a fairly lengthy process. So he takes the hemlock and he asks the executioner, what do I do now? Well, to make it work better or faster, one thing you can do is walk. Keep walking. Well, this is an old man and he's just taken poison. So he's able to walk a little bit by himself. But then he gets support. The young men, his followers, his friends, who are there mourning his death, they come and prop him up. It's like he has an arm out around a couple of these guys, and they help him walk. Now, I'm not really good on literary analysis. A lot of people that are good at this can read intriguing novels, and they can see all kinds of things going on in there. About all I can understand is a simple storyline. So I say interpretations are not really my bag. However, I've thought about this. In talking about the young man supporting Plato, I said that wrong. Talking about the young man supporting Socrates, can we imply, perhaps infer, that Plato is saying that now that Socrates is gone, it is up to the next generation, it's up to the young men to prop him up? Can we say that Socrates and Plato are not terribly big on family values? Plato never married, as far as we know. Socrates did, and he had children. When his wife, and he got a couple of sons, came to his death scene, he said, go home, don't bother me. We say it's not terribly strong on family values. He's more interested in his friends than he is his family. Let's go back to the execution. After a while, even being propped up, he can no longer function. And he finally lays down. And he doesn't want people looking at his face as he dies. So he takes a cloth, and covers his face. And he's laying there, and people are wondering if he's dead yet. What's he thinking about? Well, he gives us some indication. Because he pulls back the cloth, he talks to one of his followers and says, what was it? He owed somebody a chicken? There's a debt that I owe, and I cannot pay it back. Would you be kind enough to do this for me? Yes, I'll do this for you. Once again, is Plato implying the young people want to carry on his work? They're either going to pay off his debts. We have a famous painting here. A court painter, around 1800, painted a lot of paintings dealing with Napoleon. He's a Frenchman. It's Jean-Louis or Jacques-Louis David. He's fine. I'm an admirer of his. He's got these great portraits of Napoleon crossing the Alps and doing various things. Well, Classicism, shall we say neoclassicism, looking back to the classics, was also popular themes in art at this time frame. So what we're seeing here is a painting by David, essentially can I get a bigger shot of that? Maybe that's a little bit closer frame, of Socrates taking the hemlock. The gesture with the hand, he's up there with the finger. Obviously, he's making a statement of principle. We can certainly say that there's these kinds of things, if not directly stated, are clearly implied in the Phaedo. However you want to start interpreting this, Socrates comes across to us as the great martyr for truth. He comes across to us as the great martyr for ideas. He comes across to us as somebody who would be willing to die for the search of the truth. It is true that a lot of times people who die either as a politician, for their ideals in the service of truth, have a tendency to have a much higher reputation than somebody who ran away and hid when the going gets tough. We do hear things like this. Sometimes these people become stronger in death than they were in life, because a martyr carries that kind of very, very strong impact. Let me just go within my lifetime. I remember very well when John Kennedy was killed on my 14th birthday. I'm old enough to know what's going on. My parents were Republicans, and he's a Democrat, so yeah, I kind of followed what my parents liked. So I wasn't quite enamored with him. But there were things I liked about him. Don't get me wrong. I was very sad when he died. As I recall, when he went to Dallas, this is a place where, as you know, he was shot and killed. He's kind of sagging in the polls a little bit. He wants to be renominated and reelected in the 1964 election. So he's going to Dallas to get some support, kind of like a political visit. Well, one of the reasons why he's there is to build up his support. However, when he gets killed, oh my goodness. I mean, everything he touched was gold. I mean, this wonderful man, this martyr for our country, this young, handsome, charming man who's got shot down by a kook in a Texas town in Dallas, suddenly becomes a very, very strong icon. Taking polls among the American people for decades after Kennedy was killed. Probably have to be like me to remember what happened. But you take polls, and who is the greatest president of the 20th century? This essentially gives us Ronald Reagan, Dwight Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. There are some names here that are quite important. But then John Kennedy comes out on top. Why? Well, he's a martyr for the cause. I do want to imply there's a possibility that some of the attractiveness we see among historians and scholars when they examine Socrates might be partially due to how he died. Well, let's talk about another middle dialogue, and that is the Republic. Probably the most famous dialogue, written once again by Plato. And Plato is probably written after the account of the Phaedo. So can we say somewhat this is a retrospective? In this, Socrates is the main character. He's the main person that is involved in the discussion. But once in a while, we see Socrates standing back and commenting on what's happening. I think the Republic is literally fascinating. It's one of the most intriguing, entertaining, and intellectually advanced books I have ever read. We do have a tendency to think that philosophy is dense. It's hard to understand. I'm going to say that Plato is not that dense. He's not that hard to understand. And he brings in some extremely interesting ideas. Well, the Republic, a number of men are sitting around and are talking. And you get the ideas to the ideal state. What should it be like? Well, it's actually broader than this. We call it the Republic. It's more than the ideal state. It's a big discussion of the ideal society. It's also a big discussion of ethics, how we should conduct ourselves. Of all those discussions, the discussion of morality, discussion of ethics, is the one that has a tendency to attract me the most. It's just kind of my bias here. Well, a lot of it's quite fun. Trying to remember his name. Was it Glaucon? There's a number of characters that's mentioned there. And we're talking about the ideal state. And Glaucon comes in and says, kind of dismissing everybody else's arguments, might makes right. He who has power, wealth, influence, whatever he does is correct. How would you argue against that? Well, you might agree. If you didn't agree, how would you argue against that? Or how would you consider? I think it's absolutely fascinating. Socrates / Plato did not really destroy it, but can we say he took the argument, what I consider to be a different level? You see, Socrates says, what is the function of a horse? Well, a horse does things for you, right? You ride it. It can pull a cart for you. It does work for you. That is the function of the horse. Conversely, what is the function of the state? See, Glaucon says it's just to push people around. If you got power, you use it. And Socrates says the function of the state is to do good. So when you're making a different argument, this is really off base. We ought to discuss that which is good, not that which is, I'll say it right, that can control people. Well, there's so many interesting things, and I certainly can't recite everything for you, but let me bring a few out for your attention so you have a feel for what this is like. There's a statement here about intellectual prowess, looking forward to better things. Remember, going back to Socrates' catchphrase, know yourself. And in this dialogue, Socrates talks about what we call the allegory of the cave. You see, the world, he says, is like living in a cave. You and I live in a cave. And we're not facing the entrance to the cave. We're not facing the opening. We're facing the back wall. And we look at the back wall. What do we know of the outside world? A little flash of light, maybe a few shadows, a small amount of movement. We look at this and we go, well, that's the way the world is. And we look at it and we're very confident and comfortable. It's what we know, it's what we understand. But then there's one among them, a man of great courage, at least intellectual courage. He finally realizes the light is coming from behind him. It takes every moral fervor he has. He gets up and he turns around and he goes toward the entrance. He walks outside the cave and he sees the world that you and I are familiar with. The sun, the flowers, and the chirping birds, the beauty of the sky. I mean, my goodness, this fascinating world out there. Because he had the courage to ask the question. He had the courage to be intellectually active. Then he returns. He goes back into the cave. And he tries to convince everybody else back there. It's there. It's out there. It's so beautiful. Have the courage to look. But these people have no courage. They sit there and say, nope, sorry, I can't do it. I'm afraid. It takes too much effort. There's another issue, which I think is a lot of fun too, is the allegory of the ring. Pretty simple ring. I don't know enough about jewelry to tell you exactly. Let me see if I can show you more of what they were probably thinking about that time frame. Do we have a ring? Okay, well, these are rings. Oh, we got the Ring trilogy, Tolkien's people. Now let's try Plato and see if that'll give us something that might look a little bit more like a ring. Well, we're not saying it. The idea about this is that there are aspects to rings, I'm sure. And a lot of you probably have rings that have precious jewels on, rubies or diamonds, something like that. And the idea was that they said that there was this ring, I think the ring of Gyges. And according to Greek mythology, also known as folklore, Greek mythology, it did exist. And when somebody wore it and turned it to a certain way, it made him invisible. With people wearing the ring and they turn this, becomes invisible. Immediately, nobody is aware of his presence. Nobody aware of who he is. And they continue their conversation as though he's not there. Very interesting story. Now, in this conversation in the Republic, there is a discussion. What would it be like if there were two such rings? And you had it. You put it on and you become invisible. What would you do with your invisibility? Essentially in the conversation, people are saying, wow, you do anything you want to do. You can seek revenge against your enemies. You could steal objects. You could have women. Everybody, if they had that opportunity, would in fact make use of it, shall we say, in an immoral way, because you can get away with it. How does Socrates answer that? He says that you're not moral just because you can get away with it. You're moral because you believe. You're moral because that you will take morality as your highest step in life. He goes so far to say this: I don't care if I was taken out and crucified. This is kind of a form of what we call impalement. The Persians were famous for doing this. You get an enemy or somebody they're executing, and they get a stick or pole, and they would put the person over it like in a soft part around your stomach. It wouldn't work if it was too sharp, then you just fall through and you die. If it's too dull, you fall off. It had to be just perfect. So the weight of your body would slowly push that stick through you and slowly torture you as it's killing you. That's a pretty severe form of death. And Socrates says, I would rather have that experience, going through that for morality and truth, than become invisible and get away with something. Has he really dismissed that argument? Not so much. But in reality, what he has done, like the allegory, like he's talking about the horse, when you take it to a different plane, the function of the horse is to help people. The function of the state is to be good. The function of morality is for you to lead a good life. I found this quite intriguing. I kind of came up with this relatively independently when I was a kid. Don't get me wrong, I'm not an intellectual, I'm not an egghead. I'm not sitting around all my youth going, what is the nature of being? I'm not doing anything like that. But it's not, on the other hand, it's not like I'm brain dead. I remember thinking about that. And it wasn't invisibility to me. It was just a question I asked myself. What would happen, just like one day, what would happen if you knew with absolute certainty that whatever you did in one day, you would not be responsible for? There's not going to be social stigma. People aren't going to say bad things about you behind your back. The police are not going to arrest you. If you had that opportunity, what would you do? I didn't come up any resolution to that. And it might be apparently up to the individual. But in my case, what I thought I would do, if that did happen one day, I would turn off the light, lock all the doors, and go hide in the basement till it was over. I wasn't really vindictive. I didn't want to get anybody. But I didn't want to get had either. An interesting thought, is it not? Sometimes we talk about Plato as the first feminist. This is also in the Republic. He actually talks about the men and women. This is rarely argued this time frame, though Aristotle will come back and discuss this later. The first feminist. he looks at men and women. And he says, yeah, there's some slight physical differences, but they are slight. Women have as much intellect, as much reasoning power, as do any men. They're strong morally. You see, putting women in a I'll get it right, in a disadvantageous position is really a crime, because you give them opportunities, education, everything else that goes with that. They will perform as well as men. The only difference is maybe in a muscle contest, they're not going to come out as well. And maybe they're not going to fight as well in battle. However, we do read about, in Greek mythology, women fighting. I would call this very advanced for his time frame. Very unfortunately for the role of women in society, this is kind of a flash in the pan. A lot of other social aspects, a lot of other philosophers don't really pick up on this. It would take a major change to give women more opportunities. But I am quite pleased that he said this. I don't agree with everything that he says. My 20th century biases are somewhat different. For example, he said that parents shouldn't raise their children. You should take children and put them in institutions. In fact, they don't even have to know who their parents are. Take children, take them away, and then have the state raise them. The state puts, shall we say, their social value, which are the values of the state, on the society. This is how you create a better society, by teaching these kids the right thing from a state perspective. As good or bad as I was as a parent, my kids are grown now, so I'm kind of out of the loop right now. It's still my responsibility, I thought. Now, love my kids, but you know, there are times when they want to comment, Dad, you should have done this, you should have done better. Yeah, I probably should have. But at least it was my decision. If I made mistakes, it's my mistakes. Let me couch that a little bit. I don't like what they were saying. I still think God raised my own kids. But how much am I actually doing? You go to work. You're tired. You come home from work year after year after year, and you're so tired you can't move your eyeballs. Come lay on the couch and go, please. Can I possibly survive? Because I got to come do it tomorrow morning again. Well, the kids go away to school. They're not at school as long as you are at work. But they come home and they're tired too. So what do I see in my kids? I see the back of their heads when they're playing computer games. Who's interacting with them? The school. When they have energy and time, they're more interacting with them than I am. Even though I don't agree with Plato's ideas, as we look at modern society, there's a lot of times when I'm saying, well, I'm not sure I'm doing all the teaching that's going on here. Quite frankly, I'm probably only doing a relatively small percentage. This is true of places like Great Britain. Very commonly, they send their kids away to private schools, boarding schools. You take your kids, small children, and you take them and you put them in boarding schools. Yeah, you see them on holidays. They come home for Christmas. You know, they know who they are. They know who their parents are. But in reality, they're placed in what we could loosely call a barracks, where they're taught the proper Queen's English. They're taught Latin and a lot of other things. These are pretty bright schools. Some people say that's the best way to raise people, is in this kind of environment. So these ideas aren't dead. In reality, and this is also true of many wealthy American families. I hear more about this back east than I do out west, but we do have a few residence schools in Utah. Any of them. To me, Plato is endlessly fascinating. The guy is really interesting. Well, let's take a look at the laws. Now, the late dialogue. Maybe I should introduce a little bit more of the biography of Plato. After Socrates was executed, Plato couldn't stand it. He left Athens and he traveled around. Some people look at his ethical teachings and say, well, did he come in contact with the Jews? Did he go over to the Middle East and talk to them? We do see some similarities, do we not, in the kinds of ethics which are being discussed in Plato and the kinds of things we read about in the Bible. I don't think that we can make a strong case for that because there's so many differences between the two. It's hard to say that the Bible really influenced Plato. But he does come up with the idea of the philosopher king. Can we say that's implied in the Republic? Where you have somebody who's the bright guy, who's on top, who controls the state, who teaches young children they grow up to be good members of the state. We do believe he went over to the island of Sicily. There's a city there called Syracuse. And they're Greeks. Remember, there are Greeks on Sicily. And he went over there and he tried to convince the leader, the king, to be a philosopher king, to be a man of great morality and decency. As far as we can tell, the guy acted like he was listening to him, but then he tried to kidnap Plato and make him a slave because he looked upon him as an economic asset. So it didn't really work very well. Plato, as you can see, lives quite a while. That's a pretty long life. We say over time he became bitter. Over time he became mean. Over time he became a bitter old man. Late in his life, he wrote the laws. For his reputation, I wish he'd never written it. I knew it by reputation before I'd ever read it. I finally said, well, I shouldn't really talk it down, condemn it, at least until I've read it. Late dialogue. In the laws, Socrates doesn't even show up. We have to therefore say that the basic ideas here are solely Plato. It's kind of a casual thing. Usually when we read the dialogues that Socrates is in, it's like you meet a person or you're going to a meal and everybody sits around and talks. Well, the laws are a little bit like that, only we have, I believe it's 3 men, as I recall. They meet on a road in Greece. Guys are walking on through. And they start in with a conversation as to the nature of the state. We've already talked about that a little bit in the Republic, have we not? But now Plato is coming back and readdressing that same issue. The laws. How do you make the ideal state? There's something we call free will. That is your ability to choose. In a religious sense, when we talk about, well, if you're into Christian theology, free will is your ability, if you work and do good works, if you serve the Lord, that will merit your salvation. In this philosophical sense, free will means that you are free to do that which is good. Plato utterly rejects that. It is totally gone. You do not leave people with the choice because they will choose bad things. Is he so embittered by the death of Socrates, going back decades before? He can't get over it. And this is his way of striking back. The choice of the people is wrong. What we need is force. We need coercion on every aspect of society. In the dialogue, he goes so far as to say that Sparta is our goal. Really? Because Sparta has outlawed sin, outlawed crime by this, and I would call it a vicious, repressive military state. He doesn't say that. But by their force, forcing people's conduct, now we have the ideal state. I can dismiss this because I disagree with virtually everything in it. On the other hand, it's been around for a lengthy period of time. You see, later on, some of the dictatorships in the modern world, like the Soviet Union, communist dictatorship, they can look at Plato and say, look, this brilliant man, this brilliant mind, spending all of this time, he finally came to a good knowledge and understanding of the truth. That force is necessary for a moral society. Therefore, in using force in our communist dictatorship, we're doing the right thing. We're forcing people to be moral. We're forcing people to obey. That is the best way to have a good society. I do have to believe that with or without the laws, the communist dictatorship would find any excuse they could to use force to control their society. However, it's too bad they can use Plato. I wish he'd never written it. Well, he sets up a school. I told you I'd come back to this. I'm going to come back to it. He creates the academy, a school. Sometimes you will see books that are talking about ancient Greece. They'll call this a university. No. It's not a university. While you and I are familiar with the university, well, you're sitting in one right now. This is a university. It's actually a medieval institution. Now, I'm not going to say it's identical, but I'm going to say it's very similar. I mean, including how many years does it take to get a degree in the Middle Ages? It takes 4 years. How many years should it take in our system? It takes 4 years. You have a bachelor's degree, you have a master's degree, you have a PhD. In the Middle Ages, and we do now. The similarities are there. It's not identical. There's strong similarities. One of the more important aspects of the medieval and modern university is that as you learn, tentatively speaking, that is a license to teach. As you learn and you achieve your academic level, you go out into society, other schools probably more often, and you spread that knowledge and spread that learning. This is a big difference. There's a curriculum in the university. What's the curriculum in the academy? You essentially sit around and talk about Plato. There's no indication that you have ranks, and there's clearly no indication that you take this information and you spread it out. But it is a school. I mentioned to you last time, it exists for like 1,000 years. It goes on for a very lengthy period of time. Finally, in the 6th century AD, in the 500s, both the academy and the lyceum are disbanded by the emperor of Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor, because he doesn't like them. My difficulty with the academy is not that you shouldn't talk about Plato, but it's largely, you have Neoplatonic thinkers, people spin off on Plato. But in really spreading knowledge, it's not terribly strong. One of the followers of Plato is Aristotle. While Plato creates the academy, Aristotle creates the lyceum. Why? Well, as we look at Aristotle, and I'm probably oversimplistic on him, but look at many of his ideas. He wants to one-up Plato. And Plato says this, why say this? And he does create a counter school. And as we'll go on, a counter argument. He writes the books on politics and ethics. I was a little bit surprised. I'm a modern person, and I bring my 20th century biases when I was in school to the discussion of almost everything I see. But I thought I'd see a book of ethics about, well, you should be kind, you should be decent, loving and friendly, all these kind of things that I was taught was good morality in my life. And he says, well, do not forgive people, because how on earth, therefore, will you pursue revenge against your enemies? And go, whoa. When I look at this, and this is not the only argument he makes, with which I disagree, because my biases are different. Rather than calling these books of ethics on how to make you a better person, and I'm going to say these are contra ethics. These are actually things that don't make you better at all. Well, I don't want to skip over politics. I should address this. He says a few things here once again, that I think that I disagree. Remember, Plato is the first feminist, while Aristotle is a male chauvinist pig. He says there are two kinds of people, basically people that are inferior, slaves and women. And when they attempt to rise above their station and become more, I guess he's being either economically or socially or intellectually, it is our duty, it is our obligation to push them back down where they belong. Keep those women down. Keep those slaves down. And this is good. I want to hit him with a different argument. If these people have to be at this station, if they're intellectually, morally, however you want to look at it, at this level, how is it that they're rising up? You shouldn't have to push them down to a lower level. They should be stagnant. The fact that they are pushing themselves up, does that not at least indicate that they have more moral suasion, more moral ability, more intellectual ability? I would argue from my biases that you're doing them a grave disservice. Probably society can benefit from their expertise and contributions. You're doing everybody a disservice by forcing them back down. In physics, Aristotle wants to be anything to everybody. He wants to be the entire, set up an entire scope of knowledge that embraces virtually everything. He writes a book on physics. Well, physics. We're familiar with this because a number of things he says are really kind of screwy. For example, there's an idea of what we call epistemology. It's a long word. Epistemology means how do you know things? If you and I are talking about science, we know things, we call it the scientific method, which is largely invented in the modern time frame, largely in the 16th and 17th centuries, where you have the idea of experiment, cause and effect, data, inferring from the particulars. According to Aristotle, he's not alone in this. Plato kind of follows this as well, though Plato's not nearly as interested in the physical world as is Aristotle. The idea is this. You have knowledge already all here. It's all here. Well, how do you learn? You recognize what's here. So therefore, you can think logically, can you not, about the world, and that's the way it is, as long as your logic is sound. If we were in a classroom, I like to do this. If we were in a classroom, and of course there's a stool that up in front of the computer, and the chairs that you students sit on usually. And I would bring these out in front of you, and I would say, what's this? You say a chair. And I'd say, what's this? And you say it's a chair. But it doesn't quite look the same. There are significant differences. The idea that someone like Aristotle would say, that there is a concept within your brain already, back there somewhere, of what the nature of the chair is like. And when you see various aspects out there, you are now recognizing what you already know, that in fact is a chair. There might be something to that. But let's go into physics. I'm sure you're aware of this. Where's a hand grenade when you need it? Bear with me. I can't let this one go. Okay. Here we have your good neighborhood hand grenade. This is a dummy. It's not a real hand grenade. Notice it is hollow on the inside. This will not blow up. Kind of heavy. What I have here is a pen. The hand grenade is a lot heavier than the pen. So what would happen if I dropped these two things simultaneously? Well, according to Aristotle, this is heavier. Therefore, it has to fall faster. Let's make up numbers. Let's say this is 10 times heavier than this. And it might be. It might be more than that, actually. So I took these things up, let's say 10 feet. Get on a ladder, go up. And I drop these things at the same time. Not only will the heavier object fall faster than this one, but since it's 10 times heavier, it will fall 10 times faster. So by the time we drop these at the same time, by the time this has fallen 1 foot, this has fallen 10 feet. Well, how do we know that that's wrong? Galileo, 2,000 years later, did experiments in dropping heavy objects and light objects and found out they fall at the same velocity. As far as we know, in that 2,000 years, nobody had ever tested this theory. It is so logically correct. In reality, it's wrong. On the heavens, kind of an amateur astronomer, maybe it's better put this over here before it falls on my toe. Sometimes we talk about on the heavens. I'm an amateur astronomer. I don't know anything about astronomy, I just like it. And Aristotle believes that everything is the perfect sphere. Everything in the universe. You and I would actually more refer to this as a solar system. But everything's round. Everything's round. You look at the moon, the moon's round. I do not recommend that you look at the sun. That can do damage to your eyes. But if you glance at it, you can kind of tell it's round. The earth is round. I'll explain more about that in a minute. Aristotle, everybody knows the earth's round. And in any event, so we have the planets move around, don't they? Now we can stand here on the earth and we can watch the sun and the moon and the planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They're all going like this. Their orbits, what you and I would call orbit, is a perfect circle. It goes perfectly around the earth. And everything in the earth is, every object in the sky is round. That's his logic. It makes perfect sense. But then there's something, of course, the earth is the center of everything. Because you stand out here and look up, everything's going around it. But there's a problem, which is kind of hard for him to explain. It's called retrograde motion. Retrograde motion. Maybe I have something that can help you here. Now, we're watching, let's pick on Jupiter. Big, beautiful, bright. It's easy to find Jupiter. You go out in this big, bright star. Bingo. It's the brightest thing in the sky. Well, Venus is actually brighter, but it's always off on the sides. If you take out the sun and the moon and Venus, well, Jupiter is the brightest thing in the sky. It's very easy to find. If it's not up, you don't see it, but it is up. It's pretty easy to see. And as you look at it, and you're watching us over time, we have what we call behind it the fixed stars. The stars don't really move. The planets do. But in relationship to the stars, we see the planet going through the stars behind them. And then for a while, it goes retrograde. It goes in the opposite direction. It does that for a while, and then it goes forward again. Whoa. Everything is circular. Everything's around the earth. But how is it that now you have this going backwards? Well, Aristotle essentially says this, that as the earth goes around, Jupiter, for whatever reason, as it's going around the earth, every so often again, it has a little loop. It has its own, it just does it. We're not really sure why, but it simply does a little loop. And in doing this loop, that's the retrograde motion. Okay. He's making information that seems to work, right? Well, what is the actual answer to this? It takes a year, as you know, for the Earth to go around the sun. It takes about, 12 years for Jupiter to go around the sun. So virtually every year, we're passing Jupiter. And when you do so, because it's a circular orbit around the sun, when you do so, as you're changing position relative to the planet, it just looks like it's going backwards. And that's the answer that we come up with 2,000 years later. Copernicus makes a big argument about this. But the idea, let me go back here, they just figured out a way for this to work, even though there's other ways of explaining it. History of animals. Aristotle wanted to observe everything. He wanted to quantify everything. And he said everything in the water is a fish. Well, there's an animal you and I call the crayfish. See if I got it. Helps you spell it correctly. It lives in the water. Is that a fish? No, it's not a fish. Looks like a crab, doesn't it? Maybe with the long tail, it's a lobster. So why do we call it a fish? Because everything in the water is a fish. He doesn't. Can we say he rushes to publication a little bit too easily and a little bit too fast? Rather than making a lot more careful observations, which he probably should have done, he gets a little bit of information and essentially quantifies it. He puts it in a within categories. Well, there are some good observations in it. Once again, it's going to be close to 2,000 years before anybody's going to write a better book on the nature of plants and animals. But there are some problems here. He believes that if you have a room, for example, and you have rags in it, and you throw rags over the room, after a while you have mice. You probably will. But the mice come from the rags, or the garbage, or the mice introduced elsewhere. He believes in this spontaneous generation, if you will. Things are actually created simply because that's the way it happens. He says that elephants, what was it? There's only 2 diseases they can have, and one is bad gas, flatulence, gas coming out of the elephant. I think elephants are capable of having more diseases than this. Oh, he says that mice don't drink water in the summertime. Try it. Take a mouse, put him in a box in the summertime with some water and watch. It doesn't take very long. Watch, say, oh, he's drinking it. Okay, there's nonsense here. On the other hand, it's as good as we're going to have for a long time. I was telling you about how the people knew the world was round. I don't know, but this keeps on showing up. I don't know where this keeps coming from. We go to Columbus, and when I was a kid, they said, when Columbus came to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, it said, Your Royal Majesties, I can go to China, go to the East by sailing west. Still telling people that, well, they thought that they would fall off the end of the world because the world's flat. That's not true. Let me pick on a professor. I was sitting in an art history class once, this way after I got my doctorate degree, working over at BYU. I'm at a university. I got the whole thing at my feet. One of the things I'm going to do during my noon hour, I'm certainly going to go over and sit in an art history class. It's totally wonderful. You walk in there, they turn on the lights, I eat my lunch, and they show you pretty pictures. It doesn't get any better than that. This was Renaissance art. And the professor lady got up, and she said, oh, by the way, one of the great things about the Renaissance is that we finally realized the world was round. I'm going. How do you tell her that without embarrassing her? Do you raise your hand and say, I'm sorry, teacher, not correct? Do you talk to her after class and say, yeah, I'm sorry, you're not correct? You send her an email saying you're not correct. I'm sorry, I didn't say anything. Keep your mouth shut. Don't bother people. But these things are being said by people with very good educations. I don't know if they're still teaching you this to you in school, But one of my reasons for living is to correct this. Can I say everybody? Let's be fair. Everybody that we know of in intellectual circles back about 2,000 years ago knew the world was round. The proofs are actually fairly simple if you think about them. We have what we call eclipse of the moon. Remember, I'm the astronomy buff. Eclipse of the moon, when the moon goes into the shadow of the earth. And the moon goes into the shadow of the earth a lot more frequently than the moon blocks out the sun. Eclipse of the moon, you can see it all over the world, right? And you can see eclipse of the moon right after sunset. You can see eclipse of the moon in the middle of the night, and you can see eclipse of the moon way into the morning. I haven't done this for a long time, but when I was a kid, I used to get up in the morning, like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd go outside. And I want to see the eclipse. After a while, you see a little shadow of the earth go on to the moon. No matter where the moon is in relationship to the sun, you never see any indication of a flat or a disk upon the moon. That's one proof. Another one is go down and stand at the seashore. If you're standing at the seashore, you can pick the seashore anywhere in Greece if you want to. There's a lot of islands around here. And let's say you are standing here and you're on the seashore and you look at an island over here. You can see the island up here, but can you see the beach? If the island is more than 3 miles out, you can't see the beach. Why? Curvature of the earth. If you go back farther, you can see actually less of the island. Your field of vision kind of works up. Obviously, why? Curvature of the earth. If you're standing on the seashore and you watch one of these large vessels going out here, remember I told you last time about the Greek triremes, very large vessels. You can stand here and you look out there and you go, oh, you watch that vessel go out and the front of the vessel disappears before the back of the vessel. If the world was flat, the ship would go out there and it'd go little bit back to just a tiny dot till it got beyond your ability to see that far and then it would disappear. But it doesn't do that. It appears the bow first. Obviously, there's a curvature involved. This is the big one. Remember, we have Greeks. I'll talk more about this in a little bit. When we have Greeks living in Egypt, not quite yet, but living in Greece. Of course, the Greeks trade back and forth. They're very familiar with Egypt, even though there are a lot of them living there yet. And as you look at the night sky, you look south, and you see a certain level where you see stars. No matter what time of the year, it only goes down so far. You only see so many stars. This is your level. But you cross the Mediterranean and you go into Egypt, you go up the Nile hundreds of miles. What you see when you get down there are stars that you never see in Greece. You see more stars down here. This is proof that the world's round. And everybody knows it. When we get to the Hellenistic, I'm going to talk about Eratosthenes, and he's going to actually scientifically measure the circumference of the earth. We'll get back to that in a little while. Aristotle's impact on intellect in the ancient world is very, very strong. As I've mentioned in a couple of contexts, there are things he talks about that people aren't even going to talk about for many, many centuries. When the church, I'm talking about the Christian church in this case, becomes a very popular religion late in the Roman Empire, Aristotle's around as kind of the intellectual end all and be all. The church does have a tendency to say, oh, we want to be up to date. We don't act like we're not connected to what's happening intellectually. So they tend to buy into a lot of Aristotle's ideas. The difficulty with this is the church almost starts to preach ideas of Aristotle that in reality don't hold water. Now, we can never say that Aristotle is a doctrine, but can we say he's convenient for ideologies? Now, the church is very old, as you know. By the time you get to the Renaissance and people like Galileo, when you start realizing that Aristotle is in error, then you have a different problem. And that is, well, how do we reject him? So there's going to be this clash. We can't talk about this in this course. In the modern civilization course, depending on your professor, he or she might address these issues. But as we look at the impact of Aristotle, in reality, he has a very, very strong impact on the ancient and medieval world intellectually. Would we like to know more about Aristotle? We know he wrote dialogues, but none of them exist. People talk about them. They were brilliant. We know he wrote essays. How many of those exist? Well, notice these books are his books. Well, they're attributed to him. We can be very, very, very secure. What we're talking about as far in Plato is concerned, these are actually written by him. Aristotle, did he actually write these things, or were they written a few years later, or written kind of like the school of him, like his followers at the Lyceum? That we can't be completely sure. One of the reasons why there's some question about this is some classes say, is the style consistent with one writer, or were they somewhat edited later on? Would we like to know more about Aristotle? We'd like to know more about everybody. I was quite interested in this. I found this quite fascinating. In the 1st century AD, Mount Vesuvius blew its top. Enormous explosion. Covered up Pompeii, the city of Pompeii, with pumice. It's quite deep. Was it 18 feet deep, something like that? A lot of people died, something like 2,000 people. Out of the population, maybe 20,000 people that lived in Pompeii actually died. However, it's not so deep that you can't get back in. The survivors who ran away come back and said, well, I can't live in that house again, but I'm going to go inside and I'm going to do something that's important. You can go in and get artifacts, statues, and books. They're very expensive. You want to save these. So the spectacular finds are really not quite as available in Pompeii. But a city nearby was Herculaneum. And Herculaneum was covered with a flow, not just of ash, but of mud as well. It was so deep that there's no way that the people living that time frame could tunnel back in and get what they wanted. So it's encapsulated. So there's the potential of finding more things there. When some of the early excavations were done, they kept on finding these little like charcoal rolls, not knowing what they were. Charcoal, I should say carbonate. Okay, any event. Later on, people say, what are those scrolls? They might be books. Now, you can unroll them, the whole thing literally falls to dust. But in taking the scrolls, with modern technology, I guess, x-rays or other scanning devices, you can go in there and they can read these things. What do they want to see? Aristotle. What they find? Nothing much is terribly exciting, unfortunately. Now, they haven't read all of them. A lot of them are what we call Neoplatonists, who are kind of discussing a little bit more about Plato. Well, it's adding to our knowledge of the ancient world, but the spectacular intellectual finds, unfortunately, that really hasn't happened, at least not yet. Now, let's move on. Spend a lot of time on philosophy. Let's talk about the later time frame in Greek civilization. We call it the Hellenistic. Remember I told you earlier? The Hellenic is the early time frame, which we largely say the cultural influences are largely within Greece itself. The Hellenistic is when you have the conquest of Alexander the Great, which brings the Greeks into contact with a lot of other civilization. But the information goes in more than one direction. Greek ideas go to the Middle East and North Africa. Well, ideas from North Africa and the Middle East tend to go back to Greece as well. So we find a much broader intellectual milieu. What's going on? Well, what happened to Greece? I kind of jumped away from Greek history, the flow of Greek history. to talk about Greek civilization. Remember art and history and drama, those kind of things. Well, I didn't continue with the scope of the chronology, if you will, of Greek history. Remember I said at the end of the Peloponnesian War, 404 BC, that, I think I got time, then 404 BC, that Sparta won the civil war with Athens. Got a few minutes. And in doing that, I kind of gave the indication that kind of ended. It didn't end it. We're just getting started. Sometimes we call this the suicide of Greece, because even though Sparta wins the Peloponnesian War, there's all these other states. They're vying for authority. They're vying for hegemony. They're trying to get control. They're jealous of other people. We have a series of civil wars going on for decades between various groups. The Spartans, the victors of the Peloponnesian War, are ground down. They don't have a large number of manpower. Finally, they're down to about 100 men, and they're all killed. So the strength of the Spartan army literally disappears because the army's gone. And because they raised children to be warriors from a very young age, it's hard to get a buildup of these men. So Sparta decreases significantly in power. Subject peoples rebel against them. And Greece proper, however, in all the wars, becomes weaker and weaker. Therefore, they become subject to the possibility of external invasion. Civil wars in Greece, here I go. 4th century BC. Now you get to a point where they're so weak that an external invader can come in. Let's look at ancient Macedonia, give you an idea where it's at. Well, I always get the wrong map here. Essentially, we often talk about Greece proper as being down here. Remember the islands of the Ionian Greeks. Yeah, and the Persians are over here as well. There's an area up here called Macedon, or Macedonia. And they are kind of considered country bumpkins. They're not as sophisticated intellectually as far as civilization is concerned as we see down here. Yes, they speak a Greek dialect. You can communicate with them. They're not heavily involved in the civil wars. So they have a lot of strength left when Greece has virtually fought itself out. Philip II, the king of Macedonia, you can see his dates, leads an effort to take his armies down here and conquer Greece. At the Battle of Chaeronea, one of the more significant battles in history, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he is successful in conquering a coalition of armies of various Greek states that came to defeat him. But he's completely victorious. Remember his young son, he was either 16 or 18 years old at this time frame, we think, was leading the right column. His name is Alexander, later known as Alexander the Great. So this takes us as far as I can go today. We're going to talk more about the Hellenistic next time. In the meantime, I appreciate you staying with the course. Hopefully this has been somewhat interesting for you. But we're going to leave the affairs of the mind for a little while and go on to broader concepts, at least next time. In the meantime, whatever you're doing, please enjoy and have a great day. Goodbye. Oh, how about pushing the right button?